All right, well, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started today. My name is John Kenyon. I'm the director of the City of Literature organization. I'd like to welcome you to the 6th day of the Iowa City Book Festival. Hard to believe that we've already hit 6 days, but we have many more days to come. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at the programs that are on your seat. As you can see, we have 6 columns of events, and we're only into like the second day or second column, so we've got a lot to come. I hope you'll be able to join us for other events over the course of the next 10 days or so. But we are here today to hear about Shared Sisterhood, how to take collective action for racial and gender equity at work. I will say, for those who are in the room, our friends at Prairie Lights are in the back, and they would be happy to sell you a copy of the book. And I know that Beth would be happy to sign that after the event. But we're joined by Dr. Beth A. Livingston, who is one of the co-authors of this book. And Dr. Livingston is an associate professor in management and entrepreneurship at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business, and an internal advisor with the Healthier Workforce Center of the Midwest, and the faculty director of the DOOR Tippie Women's Leadership Program. After receiving her Ph.D. from the University of Florida and her MBA from the University of Kentucky, she began her career at Cornell University in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations before moving to the Midwest. And we're all the luckier for that decision. She's passionate about studying human resources, gender and diversity, and the management of work and family in the service of employee well-being. This new book from Harvard Business Review Press was co-written by Dr. Tina Opie, an associate professor of management at Babson College, and we hope that she'll be able to join us electronically sometime during the course of this hour. In the meantime, please help me welcome Dr. Livingston.
Thank you all. I am so excited to be here as part of the Iowa City Book Festival. It's an exciting situation to write a book, but then to be able to talk about it to people who show up and want to hear you talk about it is a really surreal experience. So thank you all for coming, and for everyone who is watching on YouTube, which is also exciting to be streaming on YouTube, which is an experience in and of itself. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Tina and my book. I'm going to give you just a little bit of a background in terms of why we wrote it and what it's about, and then I'll do just a brief reading from it, and then you all can ask any questions that you have about either the way we wrote the book, how we wrote it. We wrote it all via Zoom during a pandemic, so that's an experience in and of itself. Or you can ask us about what we hope to achieve with it or where we hope to go next. And again, thank you, John, and Prairie Lights for having the book available for you. As a note, it doesn't officially come out until Tuesday next week. So you all will be among the first to have it in your hands if you get it now, which is really exciting. So thank you to our publisher, Harvard Business Review Press, for being on the ball, and Prairie Lights for navigating that, which is great. So why did we write? So I'm a professor, so of course you know I have slides, right? Because that's just the thing that we do. But not that many, I promise. Why did we write the book? So, you know, Dr. Tina Opie, who is my friend and my co-author, had been thinking about this idea of shared sisterhood for a while, of why, if feminism is meant to help all women, if gender equity is about achieving parity and equity across genders at work, why is there this divide between Black and white women in the workplace? And she'd been pondering this question for quite a while, had been working on a white paper to kind of think about the history. She's married to a historian, and so she was really thinking about the history, particularly in the United States, between white and Black women in the workplace. And she began to think about this in a more systematic academic way. And about 5 years ago, she shared with me this essay she had written, and I was like, this is great. Shared sisterhood, what a great idea. What an opportunity to, instead of waiting for other people to come up with solutions, to come up with solutions for ourselves. And we began to, as many academics do, to engage in research on this topic, because of course we want to get data and information before we begin to write about it. And we engaged in podcasts with HBR's Women at Work. We conducted research. And then the summer of 2020 occurred. And with the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, she was from my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, these issues became more urgent. Companies started reaching out to Tina and saying, what can we say? What can we do in the wake of this moment, right? How can we be a part of this? And we realized that the time to write the book was now. And again, you see stagnation in these racial and gender equity. If you just look at outcomes like the number of CEOs from different racial, ethnic groups across gender, across race, if you look at the gender and the racialized gendered pay gap, for instance, you see these sorts of gaps in their stagnation. And it remains to be seen, well, what's the solution to that, right? Can we legislate it away? Can we lead it away? What can we do to solve these problems? We also recognize that we're starting to have more of a conversation. I mean, companies started to say, for the first time, we can say racism in a boardroom, right? Which is a big step forward. But what sort of solutions do we start to give to companies who are interested in this? And what we realized was there were a lot of conversations that were happening around individuals. How can individuals be anti-racist? How can you engage in that work on yourself to become less prejudiced, perhaps, or to work individually on your thoughts, your feelings, your minds? And then we had people starting to talk about systems. Well, systems, what does that mean for there to be systemic inequities in society? And we said, well, there has to be a bridge between those two things, right? Because as an organizational scholar, and Tina as an organizational management scholar, we know that systems are constructed and maintained and run by people. So we wanted to construct a solution and talk about these things of bridging this divide from the individuals and their thoughts and their feelings to the systems that they build, they construct, and they enact every day. And then the final reason we wrote this book is because we're radically optimistic people. We believe that, yes, we can make progress in these areas. We do believe that we can build more equitable organizations and societies, and we wanted to be part of that solution. So we do a lot in academia of problematizing things. What are the problems that we see? And this was an opportunity to construct solutions. And so we engaged and embarked on a very long journey of writing this book. Just as an aside, and I'm happy to answer questions about this later on, or if my co-author logs on as well, we can talk about this. We pitched this book in the summer of 2020 to publishers. Until 2 weeks ago, I had not seen Tina in person for 3 years because of COVID and because she lives in Boston and I live here in Iowa. And we wrote all of this on Zoom, on Google Docs, through long conversations and text messages and recording our thoughts on, Otter AI and all of these sort of tools that you can use to say, how can we distill our thoughts onto paper? And it was a very gratifying situation, and it required a lot of vulnerability and a lot of hard work. But I can't wait for all of you all to get a chance to read it. So what's Shared Sisterhood? I'm going to give you just the little cribs notes of what it is to engage in Shared Sisterhood, and then I'll do just a brief reading from it, and then I'll answer any questions you have. So what is Shared Sisterhood? So this is a picture that Tina and I took 2 weeks ago when we were in Louisville together, the very first time we were able to see each other after 3 years of being apart, and I reached out to a woman that I went to high school with and who I knew was a photographer, and I said, will you take our picture? Will you capture us? And she just let us interact, and we had jokes, and we talked about our world, and she captured those moments. And this was one of who knows what sort of conversation we were having at this point in time. But again, it was so wonderful to be in each other's presence. And when we talk about Shared Sisterhood, we often say that it's not friendship, right? But it can be friendship. And Tina and I engaged in Shared Sisterhood and in friendship, and we are excited for y'all to see the product of that in the book that we wrote. So when we talk about what Shared Sisterhood is, what are we talking about? I said that we wanted to try to bridge this idea between what individuals do and what systems do, and how do we do that? Well, we talked about 3 practices that are part of this philosophy of Shared Sisterhood. The first is dig. That's that individual point. How can you be introspective about your presumptions about race, about power, about difference in society? How can you think about yourself? All of those books that everyone bought from Prairie Lights 2 years ago and started to think and read and talk about, that's part of your dig work, right? Which is, how do you dig into the things and ask yourself those hard questions? The last part, the act part, is how do you act within organizations to create more equity? But what we add there, which is really important, is that middle part, which is that bridge, which is how do you build these authentic connections between people at work who are different from you? So I'm going to talk just briefly about each of those 3 things, and then I'll read to you a little bit from the book. So when we talk about dig, what do I mean? So we talk in the book, we build on Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, this idea that we are all intersecting identities and they're salient at different parts of our life. Like I can walk in this room and I've got my author hat on, right? This is who I am. If I were to, walk out of this room and go home, all of a sudden I'm putting my mom hat on, right? Like all of these different hats and these identities that I have. If I walk into a room and I'm the only woman in the room, my woman identity is very salient to me, right? Because I am seeing these sort of differences. But I am all those things at the same time, while having those things also be salient at different times. When we talk about dig work, what we talk about is digging into what those identities actually mean and how associated they are with power in our society or in the society in which you live. So you can be a collection of different identities, some of which are associated with power, which means this sort of access to resources and control over resources, historically or currently. I have a number of different identities here, right? Some of which are more closely associated with powerful positions, like my ratio-ethnicity, which we talk about as being this idea that both marries race and ethnicity in terms of culture. I'm also a woman, which has historically been not associated with resources and control of those resources in our society. But all of these things together comprise who I am. And dig means that I'm being honest with myself about what those things are. You might sit and think about what those identities are, and you might consider how they've shaped who you are, the way you see the world. And you continue to come back to this dig practice. Anytime that you're engaging in something, you're like, wait, I don't understand what's going on. You're digging into what those blind spots are. Right? And you're continually engaging in that practice. The bridge component is about these interpersonal connections. So while you're starting to think about this dig work and having this introspection into who you are, you start to do it in service of relationships with other people. So if I see someone at work and I'm like, I feel like we share some values here. I would like to connect with this person. Right? And you've thought about the things that might stand in the way of those sorts of connections. Well, maybe we speak different languages, maybe we're from different cultures, maybe, I'm a parent and she's not, right? Some of these things that make us different, and you dig into what that means for how you might connect with each other. But ultimately, it's in service of what we call bridges, this authentic connection between people who might be different from one another. And that authenticity is really important because a lot of times we're connected with lots of people. We say hello to people when we walk by, right? We have these sort of connections. You might have friends that you talk to, perhaps you have family members. But with authentic connections, they don't have to be your best friends, right? They don't have to be people that you share all your information with. What it means is that anytime you connect with them, you interact with them, your connections are characterized by these four things, right? You're showing empathy. You're connecting with empathy. You're demonstrating vulnerability. You're willing to grow, right? To admit you're wrong, perhaps. You're trying to establish trust. Even that means you're kind of easing in to these sorts of conversations and connections. And oftentimes, particularly if you have an identity that's salient, that is from a more power-dominant group, historically power-dominant group, you're going to want to demonstrate your trustworthiness by taking risks. Standing up in that room when someone says something that you know is hurtful or unkind or biased or prejudiced, right? Instead of waiting until it's over and pulling someone aside and saying, are you okay? Which is important and matters. But learning when you can stand up and take those risks and risk your political capital to be able to build those sorts of connections. And you do it because first of all, because building those connections matters on the face of it, right? But also because you want to act. So this is a book about systems, people, and relationships. But the goal, of course, is to achieve equity in the workplace. And the reason this is our solution is because we believe that all of these interpersonal connections you have when they're authentic and when you're doing this dig work can serve as this lattice work, like this web that balances, that lifts people up, that serves as this sort of strong bond that when you are trying to achieve equity in the workplace, when you are making those difficult decisions, when you're putting pressure on people, when you're having those conversations, they will sustain you, right? They'll be able to withstand. They're not, a lot of research on coalition building is very transactional, and that's important, right? But it's like we share this one goal, and we can achieve this goal because we share it. But if instead of the only thing bringing you together is that one shared goal, there's an authenticity to that, then when you have setbacks, which you will, when you're fighting to do these things, they will withstand. And so these are the sorts of things that people might work to try to change in their workplace. They might be trying to find, well, how do we know we're successful in trying to get equity achieved? We're not ignoring relational outcomes, things that are traditionally associated with there's a reason we call it sisterhood, right? And it's not just because Tina and I are women. It's a particular play on gender, right? We talk about organizations as in very masculine terms, right? Brotherhoods, dominant, old boys network, all of these sorts of terms. And we wanted to turn that on its head and say, well, wait, what if we were thinking and leading about compassion, right? About connection, about relationships, and those outcomes matter too. I think all of us can think throughout the past couple years at how important compassion has been in our workplace, how important connection has meant in our workplace, and those of us who haven't had it, how difficult it has been to maintain a connection with our workplace in that time. And again, this is particularly meant to contrast with these sort of transactional approaches, to be able to say it's more than just we're working together for this one end. We're working together because we share a value and because we care about one another. So that's shared sisterhood, right? It's very big, but we've also been seeing it work. So in at least 12 organizations, we've been working on this, and we've been seeing it work. It's a process. You have to engage in this sort of dig work, and you have to come back to it. When you make a mistake, and you're like, oh, wow, that did not go well, you have to return to dig and say, well, why? What have I learned about myself? And then you have to repair that bridge, and it's a continual process. But when people work together to do this, and we share a bunch of stories in the book, it works. Okay, so I will go ahead and do a reading from Chapter 1 of our book. I was going to read the preface with Tina, but the preface is better with Tina because both of us write in our own voices throughout the book where we can. And then, we call out when those things are. And so it's obviously better if I'm not reading in Tina's voice and she's not reading in mine. So, from Chapter 1. On the morning of March 3rd, 1913, Ida B. Wells Barnett prepared for the Illinois delegation's march in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. The parade was strategically scheduled for the day before President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration to ensure large crowds. According to Ms. Magazine, more than 5,000 costumed parade participants who hailed from all 48 states plus other countries were surrounded by floats, bands, golden chariots, and squads on horseback. The festive occasion was designed to gain votes for women. The marchers soon encountered an angry crowd that by some estimates had ballooned to over 500,000. The marchers were attacked by the crowd, and according to White House archives, over 100 women were hospitalized while police did little to assist the marchers. Wells Barnett was all too familiar with such violence. 21 years earlier, on May 7, 1892, Wells Barnett's Memphis newspaper office, home of the Free Speech and Headlight, was destroyed by a white mob angered by Wells Barnett's writings on lynchings. The lynching mob threatened Wells Barnett with bodily harm, and she eventually relocated to Illinois. With such visceral personal experiences, Wells Barnett's anticipation of the parade was likely colored by her own experiences with angry white mobs. Unfortunately, the white woman parade organizers also prioritized other white women over their sisters of other racial ethnicities, embracing anti-black racism. For example, the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, Anna Shaw, was known to be hostile to black women and demanded that black women march in the all-black delegation at the back of the parade rather than with their state delegations. Shaw was on the record as proclaiming, "You have put the ballot in the hands of your black men, thus making them political superiors of white women. Never before in the history of the world have men made former slaves the political masters of their former mistresses." Despite the broader anti-black context, even within the women's suffrage movement, Wells Barnett was determined to walk in the parade and not with the all-black delegation in the back. According to the Chicago Tribune, Wells Barnett asserted her choice to march with the full Illinois delegation, particularly addressing two white women, Grace Trout and Clara Bark Wells, who were the leaders of the Illinois delegation to the parade. Trout stated that if it were up to her, she'd allow Wells Barnett to march. But as the National Association had decided it was unwise, she would abide by its decision. At that point, however, Virginia, Joan of Arc, Brooks, a white woman, intervened and said, "It would be autocratic to exclude men or women of any color. We should stand by our principles. If we do not, this parade will be a farce." Belle Squire, another white supporter, concurred. Rather than allowing racist social norms to distance her from Wells Barnett, Brooks recognized the common humanity that she shared with Wells Barnett in her speech, regardless of race or ethnicity. It was a risk for them to speak up in support of her and challenge the norms of racial inequity that characterized the women's movement. But they did it anyway. Trout, facing pressure from other white members of the parade who had threatened not to march if the black women were allowed to march alongside them, refused. Brooks and Squire offered to walk with Wells Barnett and the black delegation in solidarity, but Wells Barnett left the room. As they prepared to march, Brooks and Squire looked for Wells Barnett but could not find her, and though fearful that she had left out of disgust, they soon began to march. But as the Illinois delegation approached Pennsylvania Avenue, Wells Barnett suddenly emerged from the crowd on the sidewalk and confidently assumed her place between Brooks and Squire. Flanked by her two white women sisters, Wells Barnett finished the parade with the Illinois delegation as she had planned. Brooks and Squire's risk-taking engendered trust with Wells Barnett and continued a strong partnership that had roots in Wells Barnett's founding of the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1911 with their help. This example of white and black women working together demonstrates the power of shared sisterhood in multiple ways that we talk about throughout the book. And this is the picture of Ida B. Wells standing between Virginia Brooks and Belle Squire. We talk about this a lot throughout the book because we think it demonstrates how long these opportunities of shared sisterhood have been around and how important they have been to those moments of true equity that we have seen. And, we were inspired by this and something that Tina, as we were researching, and I'll say one more thing and then we'll open it up to questions. As Tina, we were doing research for the rest of the book, and we have hundreds of notes in the back, so if that's your thing, plenty to follow up on. We found out that the Alpha Suffrage Club, which Belle Squire and Ida B. Wells Barnett created in 1911 to try to encourage and convince people, particularly black people in Chicago, to vote, were responsible for signing up enough people to vote to get the first black congressperson elected, which then eventually, if you trace that lineage, comes down to the first black president in Barack Obama, who was elected from that exact same area, all traced back to the work that those women did together back in 1911. So, obviously, there's some history for you, characteristic of Tina's work and looking into those things, but throughout we have a number of different exercises and things to do, and ultimately culminating into a call to action at the end in terms of what you can do individually, what you can do interpersonally, and what you can do in your own companies to make equity a reality for you. Okay, we can get questions going here.
So Beth and Tina, thanks for writing this book. I think it's important. And I guess my question is, with the example you just read to us about the Alpha Suffrage movement, what are the organizations today that are similar to that? And do we see kind of that same, Tina's shaking her head, no, do we see that same kind of rallying and bringing together of women to address these topics, or women and men, or other groups?
One of the things we talk about
Recording in progress.
I have no idea. Okay, so one of the things that we talk about in the book that Tina pointed out that when we were talking about writing it is how the parallels with the Women's March from a few years ago and how there were a lot of racial divides in that in terms of black women and women of other ethnicities not necessarily feeling like they had to subordinate certain parts of their identity to work for women overall. And I think that's something, Tina and I did a podcast this morning, and it's something that she brought up in the podcast, which I thought was important, which is, you can't ask black women to subordinate part of their identity, right? Or any other woman in that matter. And I think we unfortunately see that a lot in these same sort of dynamics that we saw 100 years ago, where you're asked to subordinate one of your identities and the goals that are associated with that for something else. And I think our argument is that we shouldn't have to do that. Like, people can bring their whole identities to work, and we can work for that. Because one of the things that I think was clear in that in the women's suffrage march story is that Belle Squire and Victoria Brooks were well aware of what it meant to be white women in their time, and they were well aware of the hypocrisy. And I think a lot of times we talk about things being of their time, and we pretend that people 100 years ago didn't do their own dig work on this stuff, and I think that does people a disservice. People have been thinking and writing about these issues for a very long time. You know, Black thinkers have been writing about this, white thinkers have been writing about this, you know, people across the world. And so I do think it's a shame that we haven't seen more movement on those sorts of issues. And that's one reason why it was so important that we wrote the book. And I would ask Tina if she had more to add. Nope, we still can't hear you. And I'm not sure exactly why. And it's a bummer because hearing Tina talk, and I'm going to we'll have all kinds of wonderful podcasts. You all can listen to her so you can hear Tina talk about that. So any other questions?
Yeah, I've got the microphone here. If anybody has a question.
You can chat if you want, Dr. Opie.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you can put in the chat. They can see your chat up on
And while you folks are maybe thinking of questions, I had one I was going to
Yeah, jump.
ask. Reading through, particularly when you're talking about the dig process and the fact that people can find those knowledge gaps that they have, that the next step can sometimes be denial of that or defensiveness. And it seems like we see that a lot when we ask people to do this work, that they can find that first or second roadblock and it kind of stops them in their tracks. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how people can push through those, because obviously that's a thing that a
roadblock.
lot of people run into.
Yeah, and, you know, in our whole chapter on roadblocks, we talk about this because where do you get started? How do you get started? If you share a value of equity, how do you keep going? And I think it is important to recognize that in dig work, you're going to uncover things that you don't necessarily like about yourself, or things that you did that you didn't realize that you did. And we try to do a lot of separating out of intentions and impact in what we've written, because, you know, both of those things they're different, but they both affect how we connect with other people. And I think defensiveness, we talk a lot about emotions as cues. Defensiveness is a real emotion. You're going to feel some sort of way when you mess up or someone points something out that you've done, and it doesn't always feel good, right? And defensiveness is important, and as Tina said, you want to ask yourself and do this dig work. And this is what we have exercises throughout the book that we talk about this, because you really need to get honest with yourself. You may not be ready to be vulnerable with someone else with these moments, but you should respect yourself enough to be honest with yourself. Like, why are you feeling away? And one of the things we say is that emotions are data. They're cues. They tell you really important things about how things are happening in your world, but they shouldn't be the only data you rely on. Okay? They're one input to these sort of things. And I do think I often, as a white woman doing this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion work, I often get asked a lot about guilt. I often get asked a lot about that, right? Are you saying I should feel guilty because of identity? And I often say, well, I've done this work and I've identified what those emotions are, and it's not guilt, right? It's not guilt. It is, if there's a feeling that's of discomfort, it's because I know that I'm not doing the work to uncover what really is going on in my mind, what sort of comfort I'm not willing to risk, what sort of, discomfort that I don't like when I uncover. But there's power in each one of the practices of shared sisterhood. There's power in each one separately. There's power in the introspection. There's power in the action. There's power in the connection. But it's when they're all together that we think we can actually achieve lasting change. And so, I think one of the reasons we talk about that in the book is we want people to be seen. Right? Yes, you're going to feel defensive. Yes, you might deny that that's what you intended. Like it's said, well, I didn't mean that, right? And what I often say when that's the case is good. That means you'll change and not do it again, right? Your intentions absolutely matter because it means you're going to go forward and do something different.
And this is somewhat related to that, but the notion that people choose not to engage, particularly white folks, because they don't want to misstep and be seen to be racist. And so rather than do the work, rather than engage, they just decide to pull back completely. You've kind of addressed this already, but maybe explore that a little bit more, because again, it feels like that's one of those stumbling blocks that people find. It's like, rather than run this risk, as you talk about, you need the empathy and risk-taking as well, they just choose not to take that risk.
Yeah. And Tina and I, we talk about in the book, we have this 2x2. Academics love 2x2s. It's kind of the academics in the room are laughing if you haven't heard them on YouTube. But we love 2x2s, and one of the things we talk about is this sort of lack of self-awareness versus your sort of intention, and we call it kind of this bull in a china shop sort of idea, right? I'm gonna rush in and save and be the most equitable person, and look at me, and we talk about the importance of returning to dig in those moments and recognizing, really practicing these sorts of things and say, what are your intentions? And sometimes it's that your intentions aren't as pure as you thought they were. It's you want to be seen as a savior, but you don't necessarily want to do the risk, right, that it takes to do that. And understanding that about yourself is powerful, because then you get to decide and be honest with yourself about what you want to do next. But also, I think, we talk a lot about risk taking for this exact reason that, yes, you may screw up. You may say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, do something that comes from the best place in your heart and goes completely awry. But if your fear is that someone might see you as racist when you have these sort of intentions, these positive intentions, if that's your fear and you do nothing, people might see you as racist for not doing anything, right? And so it's understanding, and the more you build those sort of authentic connections, the more you're going to know what to do next. And we tell a story in the book about Glennon Doyle, who's an author, and she wrote about being asked to speak at this women's event, this anti-racism event, and she was going to speak to white women, right, about the work that needs to be done. And she agreed to do it. She was, donating her time. She was asked by women of color to do this event. And she, woke up the next morning to a whole bunch of why are you taking up space? Right? Black women have been doing this work, women of color have been doing this work, and you're stepping in to do this. It's a very, white woman, white savior, racist thing to do. And she wrote about this in her book, and we bring it into ours because we think it is so important, which is she had a choice at that moment of what to do. She could have been like, you can't win for losing, and I have a good heart, and she could have done that and made it more about herself, but she didn't. She listened. She reached out to people she had bridges with already, and she said, where did I go wrong? What can I do? And she stepped back and she figured out how better to use her resources to elevate other people's, as Tina likes to talk about amplification, to amplify other people's voices. And it's so powerful. And she talks about in her book, she's like, look, if your biggest fear is being called racist, let's examine that. Let's dig into that, right? Because there are other people who have even deeper fears than that sort of thing. And I think there's a powerful moment in doing that sort of dig work too. Tina, do you have anything to add in the chat? I'm reading your chat aloud, but they can all see it in the room, but I'm reading it for our YouTube friends.
I've got a question here.
Question?
Tina, Beth, thank you so much for just an incredible book and for the work you're doing. I want to ask you about radical optimism. Last week I did a 4 corners exercise, and I had MBA students sharing about their experiences sort of being approached by people with microaggressions and perpetuating microaggressions. And I left that session feeling kind of sad and beat up about how much we talk about implicit bias, but there is just a whole lot of overt bias, racism, and sexism out in the world. And I know you all see it, you encounter it all the time. So I'm wondering what you do and how you draw on your own energies and manage your own emotions to keep going in the face of, to stay optimistic in the face of kind of the obstacles, the barriers that are out there in U.S. society.
I really wish our volume worked because Tina and I have talked about this so much. But you're not always, I feel like optimism often is a choice, right? It's not that you just feel we're not blithely entering into it without acknowledging the challenges, I think. And there were times in writing this book where, Tina and I talked, and I'm not feeling particularly optimistic right now and don't necessarily want to engage in this sort of work. And that's valid too, right? And I think we put this together because we know that optimism is a choice that we can make. But it's a realistic optimism. And I think sometimes we think about optimism as being kind of ignoring the realities of the situation or perhaps, feeling that way. But it is a choice that we go through. And as Tina said here, my ancestors dealt with a lot more than I have. And when I get tired, I tap out. I take care of myself, I recenter myself, and for Tina as a Christian, that means prayer. And she has found those ways to center and feel, how to deal with that. And the same here. And our bridges sustain us that way too, in many ways. Whether, whoever our bridges are with, those people who help to sustain us and fill our cup when they're empty. But I think we go into this work recognizing that. The work is not for everybody, right? Like, it's not. And shared sisterhood doesn't mean you try to build bridges with every single person, regardless of how they see your full humanity, right? But, like Tina says, you see the people, the faces of the people who will benefit, and you realize the importance of the work, and you keep getting up to do it. And I think, Tina and I host a clubhouse room on Fridays. Tina hosts it, and I am a favored guest most weeks on Clubhouse. And we talk about, we've had people come in and talk about, like, the difficulty of what they're doing and what they're dealing with at work. And it does help us to make these choices. Like, we hear the pain, and not everybody is suited to do this, but we are, and so we do. And so I think that's mostly, if you are suited to it and you can do the work, you do as much as you can do, right?
Do we have any other questions from anyone here in the room with us? Oh, sure.
I have one question.
So I also appreciate you all so much, and I think the book is wonderful. In a way, this is a follow-on to Ken's question. I do worry that in organizations, we need a lot of people doing this work. And I wonder what you've seen in organizations that are doing this well to bring people along who it may not be their natural gift like it is yours, but where we need so many people to engage in this way. How do we get more people in organizations to be a part of the shared sisterhood?
Yes. I mean, obviously, right, we role model the work. Like, as Tina says, we role model the work. We work with all kinds of people. And we target people who have particular types of power within the organization. And we help them to understand what power that they have. Because sometimes, for instance, I know Tina, we've had this conversation, and we wrote about it in the HBR that we did, which is, she was working with a woman who was a white woman and did not necessarily see, sometimes you can see all the places you don't have power more than you can see all the places you do. And she was able to see, here's where I have the power to engage in this work, right? And to be that leader by example. And so helping people to understand where their power lays is a really important thing. But also, there are, speaking with executive teams, speaking with this, a lot of companies have a lot of people who care deeply about these things. They just don't know where to start. Like, where do you even go to start this? And so starting to build these sort of, we talk about shared sisterhood circles. We talk about these sort of opportunities to build connections with people who share these values. And also specific language to use if you're trying to talk to people in leadership who may care, like, on the surface, but how much do they care? Well, let's push them to care more. Let's talk about these sort of relational metrics, and let's talk about that sort of stuff. Let's give language to be able to have those conversations. I think we know there has to be a critical mass of people to create those sort of coalitions of change, but we also recognize that, that doesn't mean that we have to change everybody's hearts and minds, right? I think it's Dolly Chugg that talks about there's the 20% who are your teammates on your side, 20% you'll never convince, and it's those 60% in the middle that we're trying to get on board to build these sort of connections with. Tina's nodding. So we've talked about this stuff a lot. I don't know if you've noticed. We've had a lot of these conversations, and probably half of it is on the cutting room floor, or not really, but in Google Docs and on some sort of virtual cutting room floor.
Well, that maybe brings up a question. So you've done this work, you've got this book out there. I want to let you celebrate it, but at the same time, what's next? I mean, this is an ongoing process for everybody doing this work. Do you think of things that the next iteration of this work for the two of you, and maybe picking some of those things up off the cutting room floor and doing something with them?
I mean, we always think about those things, don't we, Tina? What can we write? What can we write articles about?
Sorry, Tina.
What can we do? I mean, we're always thinking about that. And I think, right now we're thinking about the impact of it. So we're trying to get out to leaders, to talk to people who do have a power already, right? Because those are your low-hanging fruit. You already have the power. We're just going to help you channel it. Like, how can you think of metrics differently? How can you start to push that sort of stuff? So getting in those rooms, I think, is really important. But not everybody works in companies that are amenable to those sort of conversations. And so, that's the sort of grassroots effect that we're talking about too. And so we've been talking a lot about how we help people create these circles. So we're in the process of creating book kits that will go with the book. So things that include book club guides and other sorts of workshops to be able to work. If you are, have an ERG, so an employee resource group for those of you who are, or affinity group, and you're like, yeah, I want to do some of this stuff. What can you do? Well, we're going to start providing some of that. But ultimately, I think it's just getting, the shared sisterhood does work, right? And we know that it does. So now we just need to get it in more people's hands so that they can read with us. But yeah, let us celebrate. Come on, John, give us more work to do.
I mean, it's not even officially out yet, so
I know,
that was not a fair
know.
question of me. I'm sorry. One thing, though, that I think of, you have this from the business perspective. It's the Harvard Business Review Press. You're from the business school, but there are people who obviously can benefit from this work who are outside the corporate structure or outside of business. How much thought have you given to that, lay people, retired people, people who are not in business can benefit from this and do this work?
Yeah. Well, we talk about that a lot. I mean, I think you don't go into this work without wanting to change the world in some ways, right? And I think starting with companies, because that's what we know. We know business leadership. We know this context. And I mean, people spend, at least 30% of their life in many cases at work. And so it affects their life a lot, their livelihood, their well-being. It's life or death in some situations, depending upon, where you work and that sort of stuff. But as Tina said here, she first used shared sisterhood in her residential neighborhood with community organizations, which is you have these equity goals, you have these things that are dividing you. Tina likes to tell the story that, and here I'm just stealing all Tina's stories, but you can tell how much we've talked about this sort of stuff because I'm just telling our stories, that she really knew she had something with after she talked about this in her neighborhood organization. They were talking for hours in the parking lot after it. People want positive solutions. They want to know what to do. They want to know how to come together, right? Many people do. I mean, a lot of people wanted to know how to become anti-racist or to think about prejudice differently or power differently. And then it was, well, now what? Now what do I do with all of that? And I think, organizations are parts of our lives, whether it's your community organization, your church, your, youth group, your Girl Scout, whatever it is, all of these organizations are a part of our life in so many ways. And, so of course, we think that these principles can be active in any of those places.
Right. Any final questions from folks here in the room? I don't see any. I was wondering if, just in closing, if you had any closing thoughts. You're moving into a world where everyone's going to go out and buy this book.
They're
going to read it,
John. Yes.
They're going to read it. What kind of world are we going to have when everybody has embraced shared sisterhood? What will that look like?
Well, we just think the low-hanging fruit is not to wake up every day and see yet another story of gender, racialized bias at work or in our society. It'd be really nice not to wake up with those headlines, I think, as a low-hanging fruit, but also for people to be able to go to work and feel seen, to feel heard and included, right? Yeah, you're still going to deal with jerks or whatever. Those negative things happen. But for me, I think if you saw shared sisterhood enacted, we would not be dealing with the extra burden of racialized and gendered inequities in the workplace. And to boot, we would have so many more rich, fulfilling connections with people. And, it's a fundamental component of our humanity to want those sort of connections. So. And as Tina said, it'll look like, I'm reading it for people who can't read the screen, it'll look like our research meetings. Yay. Right? Active, engaged conversation. We center equity. We learn from each other. We challenge each other. Tina and I always like to talk about all the times we challenge each other. We do that a lot. And we'll change the world around us for the better. It becomes a place where you can disagree and still care. And that, I think, is what we all want from our relationships, right?
That sounds like a wonderful world to be in. So
thank you.
We wish you all the success with the new book. I'd like to thank Dr. Beth Livingston and Dr. Tina Opie.
Thanks, Tina.
Sorry again we could not hear you, but thank you for contributing. Thank you very much.